I wrote a PhD on Utzon's work. I came to his work through, well, I suppose sort of quite late in my own studies. I didn't really have well, I was interested in his work, but I didn't have a huge interest in his work until very late in my master's. I went on a trip with the Jørn Utzon Research Network that year went to Morocco. And I was lucky enough to meet Jørn Utzon, his son, some of the people that work with him, and some of the researchers within the field. And it was just like such a wonderful experience, both being in a place that had inspired his work, but also meeting the people that had worked with him, but clearly also worked in a way which was infused with this way of thinking. And what all of them said was that he was a wonderful architect, but he was an even better person. And that sort of kicked it off a little bit. And then I heard about the Utzon archive, which was held in Aalborg, and the other half was still with the family, and it hadn't really been used for research in a substantial way. So I started digging in a little bit, and I gained access to the archive both in Aalborg and with the family. I got to know, because I'd already met Jørn, I had kind of a way in. And then I worked a little bit as an architect, and then eventually in England there was a bursary which was advertised for researching into the archive and using it for research purposes. I applied, I did my research, and like Ruth said, it was focused on the work by Jørn Utzon, but more than that, I was specifically interested in the influence of his travels on his way of working, and I was kind of looking at the way that his work evolved alongside and in response to the findings that he did along the way. And what I want to talk to you today about is partly the influence of his travels, because that's my entrance into his work. But I also want to talk about this specific project, which is a theatre in 1964, which was never built, and it's the kind of the anchor of an international 3D drawing competition that the Utzon Center is launching this year. It will go for 3 years, and each year we'll be looking at a new unbuilt project by Utzon. And this year we're looking at this one specifically. I'll get back to the competition again, but firstly I just want to talk a little bit about Utzon's work and how he came to design that building. And like I say, I kind of come to his work through his travels. That's the main vehicle that I use to understand the intentions in his work. Before we talk about his travels, I just want to dial it back a little bit and talk about, well, not too much about his childhood, but he did have a very specific one which kind of enabled a more sort of experiential approach to architecture, you could say. He was born in Copenhagen but grew up in Aalborg, and was greatly influenced by his father. The picture is a bit dark, but his name is Utzon, and he was a naval architect or a naval engineer. And the whole family moved to Aalborg because Utzon was offered a job with Aalborg, the shipyard in Aalborg. And he lived there in Aalborg until he was 18, and it was kind of a childhood which was influenced by a very outdoorsy approach to life. Jørn Utzon has recalled how his father taught him that there was things in nature that you could learn that couldn't be taught from books. They were sailing, they were building. He kind of grew up walking back and forth between his school and the shipyard, where he saw shipbuilders build these huge volumes, these huge three-dimensional geometrically complex structures, and he kind of understood that that even craftsmanship, like the work of the hand, could achieve or solve big problems. So he had this, I suppose, both this like respect for craftsmanship, but also this very sort of outdoorsy life. And I think this sketch is interesting. It's a sketch done by Ole Schultz. But it's a replica of an original sketch by Utzon that he did when he got a little bit older, and he went hunting with his father. And he had, like, even back then, he had this very sort of respect for observation, or he understood that there was that if you looked at things carefully, that if you looked at things more deeply than just looking in a superficial way of the world, there's like things that you can learn from the mechanics of nature, the way that things grow and the way that things move, that can be unlocked and potentially used for design, which is where we again come back to the work by his father, Utzon, which was very much inspired in his own approach to boat building by phenomena in nature. Eventually, the family new artists, when they moved back to Northern Zealand, especially, they became part of this artist community. And eventually Utzon decided that he wanted to become an architect. First he wanted to be a sculptor, but eventually he ended up in the architecture school. And the approach to architecture, which was taught in Copenhagen at the time, was kind of founded on classical values. Kai Fisker was leading the school at the time, and he was talking about integrity, materials, proportion. He was kind of celebrating these classical values, and at the time, this is in 37 when he started to study architects. Modern architects such as Frank Lloyd Wright was already beginning to work, and they knew about his work, but like Kai Fisker said, it was very interesting, but in his opinion stillborn, because he believed that innovation was only for the few and not for the many. But this, of course, is also a response to the war, which happened during the late 30s and into the 40s, which kind of encouraged a more regional approach to architecture, both because the borders shut down and there was a lack of import and export of materials as well as ideas, but also because of the oppression from Germany, which kind of inspired a more familiar, more comforting approach to architecture, I suppose. But historical studies in general were encouraged, and whilst Utzon also studied regional traditional approaches to architecture, like specifically he was quite interested in Grundtvig Church, which is kind of a more expressionist approach to some of the principles that Kai Fisker was talking about. He also studied especially Chinese and Islamic approaches to Chinese and Islamic history and historical architecture. And one of the books that he was poring over as a student was a facsimile copy of a Chinese building manual called the Yingzhou Fashi. We'll get back to a little bit the influence of Eastern architecture and Utzon's work, but I think what's important to understand is that this approach to architecture is based on a philosophy of harmony between building and nature. The same, although it's a different approach to architecture, the same principle applies for Japanese architecture, which he kind of continues to study afterwards. But that's lying at his desk as a student. When he finishes in 42, he moves to Stockholm, where he begins to work as an architect. And Stockholm has become this lively center for young Nordic architects who wants to work in a way which is unabated by the war, which is still going on. He meets his wife Liz, and he meets architects such as Arne Cosmo. He hears Alvar Aalto lecture for the first time. He becomes friends with Christian Norberg Schulz. He works together with Sverre Fehn. He Geir Grung, which is another modernist Norwegian architect that you may know, becomes one of his friends, and what they're talking about is a continuation of the modern approach to architecture, but what they're particularly interested in is kind of resetting the way of working based on a simpler approach to life, and certainly a greater relationship between modern architecture and the ways of nature. And they write poems, they paint paintings, they create projects together. And Utzon talks about this period as the most important period for his formation as an architect. And Arne Korsmo was one of the really important figures. Arne Korsmo was a generation older, but him and Utzon became close friends, and this is a letter that Utzon wrote because Norbert Schulz was working on a book about Arne Korsmo's work, and then he was asked to kind of write down the influence that Arne had on the generation of architects and on Utzon's own work. And this is a chair design that they did together, but basically they were interested in a functional architecture, but more than that, they were interested in a functional architecture which was embedded with meaning and an intention to create places and spaces that allowed people to live more authentically, more simply. Hugely inspired by biology, and Utzon has explained that it's probably because of Arne's father, who was a really important biologist who did these lovely drawings, that Arne had this special ability to both be an avant-gardist and a poet, like to really explore the field of architecture and to question the way that things were usually worked. He had this, Utzon describes it as, had this ability to look at a situation in an entirely new way, and he believed that was essential for an architect who wouldn't just want to work, who wouldn't just revert to mannerisms and formalistic styles, but wanted to express a specific situation, a specific place, or a specific period. In a meaningful way, and through Arne Korsmo, it became possible for Utzon to work for a short period with Alvar Aalto. And Alvar Aalto, for Utzon, what was really important about Alvar Aalto's contribution to modern architecture was his ability to create a rational architecture which was still humane and varied. And I think throughout his life, when Utzon had students or interns or even young architects working with them, they would go on these long summer breaks, and every time he would send them back to the professor, he said, back to Aalto, and he would give them a bottle of brandy, and he would tell them to say hi to Aalto for him, because he thought that the influence on Aalto would be of significance for their formation as well. And I think it's quite interesting that Utzon at this point, it's in 45, and he goes back to Denmark to start his own practice. And Utzon in 47, he writes to Aalto to ask if it's possible for him to come back and work for him. Because he is quite frustrated with all of these compromise projects that he keeps ending up with. And there's a couple of projects, especially in 45 and one in 46, which is interesting, but like Utzon says, he wants to do more, and he wants to start working on this approach to architecture that he has been developing during the 42, 43, 44 and 45, alongside his Scandinavian colleagues. And in 47, the same year, as he writes to Auto to ask if he can come back, and Auto, by the way, says that whilst he would love to welcome him back, he at the time is working in America on the MIT building, which you might know, which is this curved brick building. And Auto says, well, you could come work on that. It's not a nice place to work, and I'm not working with nice people over there. So he rejects Utzon's proposal to come back, and then he suggests that perhaps he could recommend him to Saarinen or Harrison. But the same year, Utzon publishes this together with Tobias Faber, which is an article titled Tendencies in Contemporary Architecture, where he kind of makes a personal stand, and he says the architecture of the past couple of decades based on functionalist ideas, some architects were still kind of referring to that in their way of working, but he believed that even functionalists' approaches was stylistic or superficial because it wasn't tied to its own period. And then they also discuss in some depth the importance of kind of going back to the beginning, understanding structures in nature, understanding traditional approaches to architecture, and specifically they're interested in these archetypical approaches about dwelling, about poetically dwelling, and they discuss that in length, and both of them agree that a completely new way of working is required. And in the same year, Utzon, he travels to Morocco, and that becomes. So he doesn't take up Alto's offer to accept the recommendation with Saarinen or Harrison, but he begins to travel instead because he's offered a job in Casablanca. But when he comes down there, the local currency is devaluated. So the work is cancelled, and rather than going back home to Denmark, he decides to go for a long walk through the Atlas Mountains from desert to desert on the very edge, like from valley to valley on the very edge of the desert. And he studies these rammed earth structures in the desert, and he sleeps with nomads, and he meets a king, and he meets a way of life which isn't rich in a economical sense, but a way of life which is tied to place, and a way of life where people, even though they have to renovate quite heavily on these structures, because every time there's a rainfall, they have to kind of rebuild, because it's basically sand castles erected directly from the ground. But even though they have to do that, they sing when they renovate. And there's just a kind of harmony to the way that they live, with food just outside of the door, that he aspires to. So as a result, he makes two sketch proposals. One is a factory, where the entire kind of logic of the factory is based on the sloping of the landscape. And he makes this cell planned-like housing project, which is kind of topped up against a hill, facing outwards towards the landscape, and is kind of like gradually densifying to inside towards the hill. And both projects, like these ideas, even though that they are obviously ideas, they are ideas that he returns to in his later work, and are quite like interesting in terms of understanding the evolution of his work. And he even chooses to put one of the drawings on top of an article that he publishes in 1948 when he comes home to Denmark, titled The Innermost Being of Architecture, or Arkitekturens Væsen. And in here he talks about the origin of architecture at great length. He talks about the importance of experience. He says an architect's starting point ought to be rehearsing his ability to understand how different places, different times and different surroundings influence how we feel as people. And then he talks about the idea of a seed, that architecture has a timeless seed, something that doesn't change over time, but something that you can return to as an architect to understand the innermost quality of architecture, the deepest intention of architecture. And this idea of a seed becomes a basic characteristic of his work. This idea that there's something. The historian Brodel, I don't know if you know him, but he talked about geological. He talked about different sort of durays, different like timelines of time, and he talked about this idea of geographical time. That even though that we have a contemporary timeline, which kind of goes up and down as we go into war, and as there's a low period, and as there is a period of inflation, like a timeline and a culture that responds directly to that time. He also says that there's a geographical time which is kind of untouched by the changes in our own period. And that's basically what Utzon talks about in this article when he talks about the innermost being of architecture. This idea that even in architecture there's like bird nest like typologies that we as architects can uncover, like almost archaeologically uncover and understand. And I don't think I want to talk too much about these couple of slides, but I just want to say that during the same period, he begins to explore the conjunction between art and architecture, his own work and the first generation of modern art, which is also interested in this idea of an origin, and they're interested in the idea of an origin as well as the idea of an intuitive abstract expression. And whereas it was at the time by many seen when it first emerged, seen as odd and abstract, for Utzon he understood that in abstract forms of expression there could be layered, there was a layeredness of meanings and substance. And I just want to show a couple of pictures because I reckon they're quite interesting. You can just see how these are models for an interior that he did, an unbuilt interior that he did for the Sydney Opera House. And these are works of Le Corbusier that he is juxtapositioning his own work with, like he understands his work within the context of the same form of thinking. And you can see here his own lamps next to Le Corbusier, next to chairs by Alto. And here, this is inside his workshop. This is just before the committee on the Sydney Opera House drops by in Hellebeck, and they want to see how everything's going. And usually Utzon would like take little drawings and blow them up into big scale, and then all of a sudden you've got something that looks like a lot. And here you can see a large scale model, lots of model materials and little model, and right here is a big copy of a painting by Ferdinand Léger, which is also from the first generation of modern art. So there's like he's beginning during this period. He's beginning to position himself and beginning to kind of formulate an approach to architecture. So the innermost being 48. Now we're in 49, and that's like the most, well, from my perspective anyway, one of the most interesting trips that he embarks on. Because of the war, there was lots of travel scholarships that nobody was applying for because it wasn't possible to travel in the same way that it was after the war. And he applied for a big chunk, and it became possible for him to go to America. And we know when we look at his film that he started up north with the works by Frank Lloyd Wright and moved downwards and studied works by Mies. But he doesn't begin to write a travel diary until he gets to New Mexico, just north of the Mexican border. And he starts his travel diary by describing the Taos, Taos Pueblo, which is the one of the, certainly when it was built at the time, the longest continuous social housing project, you could say. Built from adobe structures, and which had this incredible layeredness that he describes in some details. He continued to Arizona, where he stayed a while with Frank Lloyd Wright, and he, on the trip, visited other projects by Frank Lloyd Wright. He studied the Mesa Verde, which is this sort of cave dwelling, and he describes the incredible continuity between architecture and landscape. And he continues across the border to Mexico, where he meets up with Arne Cosmo, his friend from Norway. And they drive across the border and all the way down to Mexico City, where they stay for a couple of months. And from there they travel out into Mexico he spends quite some pages describing markets, how people trade, local craftsmanships, mannerisms of people, rituals. But one of the things that he is most interested in is platforms that he discuss and study at length. He even meets up with the Danish archaeologist Franz Blumen, who lives and works in Mexico at the time, who takes him out into archaeological sites where they are still at the time excavating these temple platforms. But what's really interesting when you kind of dwell on that travel diary is that certain archetypes begin to formalize, archetypes that Utzon is specifically interested in. And one of the ones that he described is the idea of a fortress-like or shy wall with very few openings, and then when you move through the entrance space, you move into a building that opens up towards the landscape. So this idea of a very evident and clear transition between the public world and the private world, between the city and the landscape. And I just included one picture here of the Kingo houses, which is a housing project on Sjælland that I really recommend to go see, which is amongst other things based on this principle of the shy wall. But I think that the earliest and one of my favorite examples is the Hellebeck house, which is from '52. So only a couple of years after he returns from this trip to America and Mexico, he begins to implement some of the ideas that he's been studying on this journey. And here he's got this long brick wall. You kind of arrive to the house through the forest, and then there's a road running in between these two walls, and then this is where you park your car, and then there's only one hole in that wall, and that's the entrance door. And as you move through that, you look directly out into a little clearing in the forest. And then the southern side of the building is completely open. So from the outside there's this immediate sense of privacy, but when you move inside, the building is sparsely furnished. You sit on the edge of the window that becomes a part of the seating. And when he was first building this, architects from Denmark, but also from America, someone like Richard Neutra, came to see this building, and they were like, wow, can you live this way? It was completely radical. But at the same time, it was based on these ideas of a simpler approach to a simpler way of living, really. And here you see some other pictures from the same project, and this is basically where the door sits, and then you move through, and then you look out into the clearing, and there's a little creek down there that you can't see in the picture. And here you can see the sort of the driveway, and this completely continuous kind of Another idea that he discussed on his journey through America, and particularly Mexico, is this sense of moving through city streets where the walls on either sides are completely closed, and then when you penetrate, you move into this microcosmos for privacy and for dwelling in nature. In Mexico, but also in Morocco, where he traveled in '47, they exploited the archetype of a courtyard building as the ideal archetype for dwellings. And in '56, he actually already, his earliest proposal was in '54, where he begins to discuss the potential of the courtyard house as a kind of archetype in architecture, which could be developed in a modern way. And that proposal is actually called Private Life. But in '56, he begins to work on the Kingo houses. This is from the Kingo houses as well, which is this continuous chain of courtyard buildings that follow the rise and fall of the undulating landscape. And he also introduced the same principle in Fredensborg a few years after. Again, you've got this continuous chain of courtyard houses where each house is practically the same, but different because of the way that it sits in the landscape and its orientation towards the landscape and its orientation towards the sun. And then the idea was that the L shape of the house, most of the interior walls were light, so that you can move them, that the interior of the house could change over time according to the changes of your personal needs. But yeah, and this is from Taos Pueblo, and you can see the sort of the relationship between the president and his own work. And then, like I said, one of the really significant experiences for him was the study of the platform in the jungle. And he in the diary, he says one of the magical things about the platform is that even though they was built thousands of years ago, when you walk up those steps, step by step by step, and you stand on the platform, you have the same feeling of elation. Like it's a threshold that prepares you for the transition between the everyday world and the world of deities. And this archetype becomes an integral part of many of his public buildings. And the most famous one is, of course, the Sydney Opera House. But it's something that he studies all over the world and uses in many of his projects. This idea of defining a sense of place, but also creating a sense of monumentality, which takes you from the pragmatics and the patterns and the noise of the everyday life into a world of another type of stillness. He studies it in Mexico, around the world, but he also studies it in the Far East during the 50s and 60s, especially when he after he won the competition in Sydney, he had the opportunity to travel to the Far East. And you can see from his pictures that he took in the films that he created that he's particularly interested in the platform, this idea of an elevated plane. And then he's interested in the juxtaposition between the platform and these floating, almost cloud-like or tree-like rooftops. And what he says is that, he articulates that when he's working on the Sydney Opera House, he says that once you have a platform, it's really important what you put on top of it, because if you want people to experience the monumentality of a platform, the expression, the architectural shape or its formwork has to be clear. And he says a flat roof, for instance, doesn't express the monumentality of the platform, nor the relationship between the space that you're trying to create and the relationship to the sky. So he studies that especially in the Far East. But I think the reason why I brought this picture in is because when he's in Mexico, he's particularly interested in this temple, which is actually the base of a small observatorium. And you can see in the pictures It's from Chichen Itza, for those of you that are interested. But you can see from the pictures that he's interested in the platform, but he's also interested in the juxtaposition between the clear geometry of the platform and the rectangular geometry of the platform, and the juxtaposition between that and then something circular. Just pointing at that. But this leads me to his proposal for a theatre in Zurich in Switzerland, which was designed in '64, but he actually worked on it into the '70s when it was finally cancelled, because eventually they decided to renovate the existing theatre in the building allegedly because of financial issues. But this was entered as a competition proposal, and it won first prize. And Utzon described it as a project which is placed on a neutral plateau, free from traffic and surrounded by trees. It will become a place during the day, which is a resting place for the city, and in the evening it will take on another function, preparing the audience for the theatre's fairy tale world, making him or her forget the routines and patterns of everyday life. And the archetypes that Utzon is exploring in this project is actually a combination of all of the archetypes that I've kind of discussed here today. First and foremost, it's a project where he explores the plateau or the platform, the undulation of the shaping of the terrain, juxtapositioned with a cloud-like or low-hanging, sort of almost like a flying carpet, if you like. But what's also really interesting about this project is that this is elevations from east and west, and you can see he's proposing this austere, closed-off facade, and then parts of the roof here is pulled back, and you've got the platform coming up here. And what he's proposing is to create this courtyard space, which is already creating a transition between the city, the surrounding city, and the experience that he's trying to prepare the audience for. And he imagined that this would be lined by trees, and then you move into the building, and then you enter this different fairy tale world, as he describes it. These are a couple of letters from Christian Norberg-Schultz. Throughout his life and work as an architect, Utzon's discussing his work with architects in theory as well as in practice. And one of the people that he continues to discuss his work with is Christian, who believed his work. He's a philosopher who is standing on the shoulders of Heidegger, and Heidegger doesn't write on architecture. Well, he does write on architecture specifically, but it's not his main subject. But what is his main subject is the phenomenology of the human experience. And when he does discuss architecture, he makes it quite clear that the purpose of architecture is not merely shelter or meeting functional needs. It's to make people conscious of the existential dimension of life. And he discusses this fourfold mirror play between earth and sky, between mortality and the deities. And Christian, he discusses that with Utzon. And this letter from '81, he writes to Utzon to say that this letter specifically is about Utzon's Bauswert Church, but he says that I want to say that it's not just your church which has inspired me, but it's the general thoughts that I have worked with which has been influenced by your way of working as an architect. And then he says your platforms and your moving floating roofs has shown me that architecture is or the purpose of architecture is to create the experience of being on earth under the sky. So there's a reference here to Heidegger's notion of dwelling poetically. And Christian Norberg-Schulz, he includes Utzon's work in one of his later pieces called The Poetics of Dwelling, where he discussed the importance of a figurative approach to architecture. Because if the purpose of architecture is to make the existential dimension of living, of being in the world, of being on earth under the sky, the figurativeness or the metaphorical dimension of architecture needs to be clear. And so he writes that your Utzon, your platforms and his floating roof has shown him that ways that architects can work which will enhance this or like bring forth this existential dimension in architecture. And Utzon writes to him to say that he agrees. But you see it in his buildings as well as in his words and his letters. You see it in an image such as this, which is from Canlis on Mallorca, which is this is inside it's much more than a living room space. It's more like a temple or a kora really. It's this space where you're overlooking the horizon, and then this magic of a window happens. And then you see it in his spaces, in his drawings as well, this juxtaposition between a sense of place and anchoredness of a building and the overhanging sky. So you've got this beautiful cloud of ideas, and they're all distilled into his work. Like publishers continued to write to Utzon to ask if he would write down his memories. And the most substantial monograph on his work, Utzon did agree to kind of help out with it. It was Richard Reston who wrote it. But Utzon did open up his archives. But other than that, when they wrote to him, he would usually say, "No, I'm too busy," or "I can't write. I've known that since I was 6." But mostly he said that you'll have to make do with the memories that I've carved into my buildings. So even though that he wasn't an architect who would commit theory to paper, there is like ideas, like really beautiful ideas embedded in his work. And what I'm here today to encourage is that you study this specific project, and try to understand these latent ideas embedded in his work. And then what I challenge you to do is to enter a competition that we're launching at the Utzon Center. And the registration deadline is about a week ago, a little more than a week. But the submission deadline is at the end of March, so you can still kind of take part. But the idea is that you study this the theatre that he drew for Zurich, which was never built. Try to understand the spatial and architectural intention embedded in that design, and then try to embark on the almost impossible, certainly very difficult task of translating that into three-dimensional drawings. And I think the exercise is, whilst it's difficult, I think it's a really important exercise if you as students commit to the method of visualizing architecture using digital tools. Because certainly in Utzon's case, it would require much more than photorealism. It would require a sense of atmosphere. It would require a sense of intention, and it would require a sense of sincerity. So I'll leave that with you. And then I just want to say, as a kind of one of the really lovely things about this competition is that Rafael Muneo, the Spanish architect, he's on the jury alongside Lene Tranberg. So more so than just the opportunity to spend some time with Utzon's work, it's an opportunity to have your visualizations, your drawings, your 3D drawings, possibly an animation presented to an architect like him or Lene Tranberg. So it can also be a way of getting some really interesting exposure with some people that certainly will have some interesting things to say. And I'm gonna, if you have any questions, you're more than welcome to multitasking, eh? That's it. I just want to show this, not to say that it's perfect, but it's a visualization of Utzon's unbuilt Silkeborg Museum from the same year. And actually, although I've never seen the drawings, I don't know anyone that has, but the ones that worked with Utzon at the time, they say that his first proposal for Zurich theatre was similar to this proposal, so underground rather than raised up on an elevated plateau. But the drawings, as far as I know, they don't exist anymore. But I'm showing you this video because it's an attempt to kind of show some of the architectural qualities embedded in his work. And I'm also showing it because it isn't photorealistic. It's attempting to convey an atmosphere. It's intending to convey a spatial complexity, which is completely, fascinating, but also completely significant for this particular project, which really evolves in section. So we offer this as a source of inspiration, perhaps, and as a starting point when you hopefully begin to think about how you will reimagine or interpret the work of Jørn Utzon. So that's it. Do you have any questions? Yeah. That's fine. That's fine.
What happens with, let's say 3 winners, or will there be an exhibition, or will there be rich and famous?
So there is a prize. God, this is the hook. I should definitely remember the first prize, but I believe it's 3,500 euros as a travel scholarship. And then your work will be exhibited at the Utzon Center. And the second prize is 1,000 euros. So there is a prize.
There should be more students hearing this about this opportunity.
Yeah, well, hopefully join. Hopefully, yeah. No, there was a bit of a problem with how it was advertised. So, but I've got this. You're more than welcome to grab one of these handouts. It's kind of like an introduction to the competition. Some of the, if not the key dates, then certainly a link to our website where you can get more information about the competition and register. Yeah. So I'll leave that here. But like,
it's just want to thank you for it's really interesting lecture. It's really nice to see once in a while, or it's actually quite rare to see a lecture by Utzon explaining the background for the shape. We are used to hear about the sailing, and those metaphors. But the travel, I think it was really interesting to see how these projects conceptually is very, very precisely anchored in the finished buildings, and I think it's important when also students look at those buildings and those inspirations for Utzon that they are aware of this background for the ideas, which is super interesting. I think I have stumbled over once in a while, also in Frampton, this idea that Utzon was really fascinated with the Cornfish Church. Just out of curiosity, is there a place where Utzon writes about the Cornfish Church?
No, but there's pictures from the church in the archive.
Okay, that's kind of the link.
Yeah.
Pictures, he was there and he took...
Yeah, he was there in person, and there's also, which is also what makes it interesting, pictures of spreads and books of the Grundtvig Church. So that you can tell from the archive that there's a sincere interest, because of course at the time people couldn't afford to be trigger happy that like we are today. When you take a picture, you have to commit to it. Like every picture is expensive, so there's you choose to take that picture in a different way from that we do today. So there's some in the archive, but no, as far as I know, he never wrote about it. But he didn't. He after 48, when he submitted the innermost being of architecture, he kind of, during that period, he wasn't able to build in the way that he wanted to, so he committed some of his ideas to paper. After that period, in the 50s, certainly in the early 50s, he started to build housing projects. But then during the later part of the 50s, his work, his practice sort of kicked off with the winning of the Sydney Opera House. So there's definitely, it seems like he committed all of his energy to building rather than writing. And then during the after he quit the Sydney Opera House in '66, it was difficult to some extent for him to find work, certainly in Denmark, but also elsewhere, because an architect is not supposed to leave a job unfinished. And then he begins to write a little bit more again. So you can definitely tell that there's, like, whenever he's busy, there's a drop in his interest in writing, and vice versa.
It's also quite interesting. I found this trip in the United States, heading toward Mexico, that he doesn't start his diary until he is faced with faces the native architecture. Even though he sees weeds, as you explained, he sees Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah, you should, and he was quite interested in that.
Where he's really caught is when he stands face to face with this Mexican Maya architecture.
Yeah,
maybe it's also because he had time to write. I don't know. But,
it seems to me when I'm reading it that it's not written ERL. So it's not a diary which is written day by day, but it's to some extent retrospective. And my sense is that he started writing it in Mexico perhaps, and then looking back at his trip, he felt that Taos, the experience that he had in Taos, the recordings and observations that he did there were the significant starting point for the ideas that he began to develop. And the only project by Frank Lloyd Wright that he included was the desert dwelling, the Taliesin West in Arizona. And interestingly, he describes that project as a platform building. And that's also why I think it's written in retrospect, at least his description of that project, because it's not, whilst he was interested in platforms earlier in his career, he hadn't articulated it as a firm idea. That came after Mexico. So, but at the very last page of his diary, he writes, "So now I've written a lot about my experiences, but the recordings that I did and the more than 300 photographs that I took will tell you much more about the importance of what I saw."
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yeah, grab a